Welcome back to Z-Speed, and thanks for tuning back in. Today I'm going to show you how to change out your front lower ball joints on your Nissan 350Z. So if you're interested in learning how to do that, just stay tuned and we'll get right on it. Now, when it comes to your Nissan 350Z, you know there's a few things you're going to have to change out after about 100,000 miles. One of them is your valve cover seals. Another one are those gas shocks that support your rear trunk. And oh yeah, those front lower ball joints. You know you're going to have to replace those. But don't worry, I'm going to show you how to change those out right in the comfort of your own driveway or garage. Now, before we can get started, of course, you'll have to place your car on jack stands and remove the front rims. Once that's done, that'll give us clear access to the lower ball joint assembly right here, this lower control arm, and everything that's attached to it. I'm going to recommend PB Blaster on all your nuts and bolts before we start breaking anything loose. Go ahead and spray down the nut on top of your ball joint right here, the nut and bolt that holds your strut to the lower control arm, the nut and bolt that holds your end link to the control arm, and then there's a nut and bolt that holds the lower control arm to the subframe. It's right underneath this piece of plastic here. That should decrease the likelihood of us shearing any nuts or breaking any bolts when we're removing all of this hardware. Before we can get started, we need to remove the cotter pin from the top of the ball joint. You can see mine's already been removed right here, so do that first and then we can get started. Now that the cotter pin's out of the way, we can go ahead and grab a 19mm socket, place it on top of this nut that holds the ball joint to the front lower control arm, and break it free. Now mine came loose pretty easily. I don't know if it's just because of the age, but hopefully yours will break free without any problems. Next up, let's remove this nut off the strut and the nut off the end link. And I didn't have any problem with my strut, but I had to struggle a little bit with the end link nut. Make sure that you use the PB Blaster. That'll help out. Once you get these off, you can tap these bolts out, and I didn't have any problems, but if you do, you can adjust your steering wheel and it may take some tension off of these bolts and make it easier to remove those. Now, to gain access to this bolt, you're going to have to remove this tray right here, this plastic tray, to get that out of your way. And then you can get to the bolt right there that holds the lower control arm in. Now, you're also going to want to turn your steering wheel all the way to the right so you'll have more access to the nut on the back side here. What that does when you turn your steering wheel to the right is it swings the inner tie rod away from this nut right here, and that'll give you a lot more room to work with. So now that I've got clear access to the nut and bolt, I've got a breaker bar and a ratchet, both 19mm sockets on those, and I'm going to go ahead and straddle the lower control arm, one arm on each side, and I'm able to break it free pretty easily here, so hopefully you'll have the same luck. And once you get that nut removed, you can go ahead and tap that bolt out as well. Now we can just tap our lower control arm out of the subframe, not a problem at all right there. So all we need to do now is remove the lower control arm from the ball joint, and that's unfortunately a little bit easier said than done. There's a little metal cone that sits in between the ball joint and the lower control arm, and sometimes that sticks, and so I'm going to go ahead and start trying to tap this control arm off the ball joint here, and no matter what I did, I could not get this thing to separate, so we're going to end up needing a tool to separate this ball joint from the lower control arm. So I picked this little pulling tool up at AutoZone. I think it was under 20 bucks, not too pricey at all. And it made pretty short work of this lower control arm. It pulled it right off the ball joint, no problems at all. So try that trick if you're having trouble separating the two. And now the next problem though is that I actually got the cone stuck in the lower control arm. Now you really don't want that. You want that to stay seated on top of the ball joint. And the problem is with that is that if you're swapping out your lower control arm, this cone needs to go on the new ball joint. But since I'm reusing this lower control arm, it's not that big of a deal, but you would have to tap this cone out, and it's made of aluminum, so it'd be easy to damage that. So yeah, it's gonna be tricky to get this cone out of the lower control arm, but luckily I don't need to. So you'll have to come up with a way to remove that if you're swapping out your lower control arm. Now, before we can remove the ball joint itself, we need to remove the snap ring that's holding it in. You can see I've got a snap ring removal tool right here, and it made pretty short work of it. You can use pliers, that's a little trickier, but to make sure you remove the snap ring before we get ready to press this ball joint out. Now I'm going to recommend this 32-piece ball joint removal kit that I got from AutoZone. I just rented it. It worked really well. It had all the parts I needed to remove this lower ball joint. Now the first thing we're going to want to do is look through this kit and find a nice metal sleeve that will fit nice and tightly around the ball joint and rest on top of the knuckle here. You can see I've got one that just fits perfect up here. Got good clearance around the ball joint and seats nicely on that knuckle. And that's exactly what we're looking for here. And now we're just going to need a lid to fit on top of this sleeve. Now next up, we need a lid that will allow the ball joint top of the ball joint to pass through the lid as we press it out. You can see I've got one that fits quite well here. Now if your cone's still attached to your ball joint, you're gonna need one with a little bit larger opening, but they should have a lid in there that will accommodate that. So now I'm just gonna line these two up nice and straight, and we're gonna grab our C-clamp, and we're going to go ahead and place the C-clamp up on top of this lid and sleeve here. Just have to be very careful that the top of the C-clamp will allow the ball joint to slide on through. So we're going to kind of loosely tighten it up here, and then we're going to make sure that everything's lined up. I'm going to kind of get up on top of the knuckle here and look down through the C-clamp to make sure everything is lined up. So once we start to push the ball joint out, it's going to slide straight to the top of that lid, and it's not going to catch on the side of it. So just have to make sure that we've got everything lined up perfect. So now we can go ahead and press this ball joint out. You can see I've got a ratchet right here. That is definitely not the desired method to remove a ball joint. You really want an impact gun, and yes, I do have an impact gun, but since my car's on jack stands here, and I do not have the clearance to get an impact gun underneath the C-clamp and use it, so I had to use a ratchet here. And I've seen some people on YouTube say, I'm not even sure that you could use a ratchet to remove it, and I'm going to say yes, you can do it here, because I did it, but it was not easy at all, and you really had to put your foot into it. And I'm going to be using my foot here in a minute. I'm going to show you how to brace yourself right here. You can see my foot right up here. I had to get my foot up there to really brace this knuckle here to keep it from flopping around, but you can use your foot here to help you balance it, and your hand, and yes, you can slowly but surely, you may have to take a break or two, you can press this thing out, and once you get it going here, it really gets easier every turn. Now make sure you use a lot of PB Blaster before you start this part of it. So you can see once I remove this sleeve and we pull the ball joint out, that it was coated with PB Blaster, so I really think that helped me press it out. You can see it's all around the joint here. So yeah, you can do it with a ratchet, but it's not easy. Now we just want to clean this area of the knuckle where the ball joint will be sliding back in. Just take some steel wool or a Scotch-Brite pad, clean that up and spray it off with some brake cleaner, and we'll be ready to reinsert the new ball joint. So I purchased a Mevitech ball joint. It's a little bit better than the original stock ball joint. And we're going to remove this rubber boot here, and this little plastic sleeve right here pushes that rubber boot onto the ball joint after we've installed it, but when you install it, you want to have the boot off so you don't damage the boot, or there's potential to damage the boot. You don't want to do that. So we're going to go ahead and slide our ball joint into the knuckle and get ready to go ahead and press it back in. Now when you're placing the ball joint into the knuckle, make sure the cotter pin hole is facing towards the front of the vehicle. It'll make it just a little bit easier to slide your cotter pin in at the end of the job. Now that we're ready to reinstall, you need to find a nice sized cup that'll fit right around the seam of this ball joint here. You can see I've got one that fits just perfectly and allows the top of the ball joint to slide through. Now I've got to find a cup to go around the bottom that'll allow the bottom of the ball joint to push through but not actually catch on the cup here, or this little lid. So I found one that was perfect, and that'll allow it to push down through the knuckle and not actually contact the lid. So this 32-piece ball joint removal kit from AutoZone is definitely the one you want. It's got pretty much every part you need in here. So now at this point, you can see I've just taken my time to line everything up so everything will go through smoothly, and then we're about ready to go ahead and start cranking it down. Now make sure you put a nice thin layer of grease around the knuckle and the ball joint, because we want to help it slide in smoothly here. And now you just have to get out your elbow grease once again, and we're going to start cranking this thing down. You can see I've got my foot in here bracing, and it's really going to be a little more difficult than it was to take out. So you can see I periodically are going to check to make sure the alignment's correct. You do not want to put it in at an angle, and if it starts to go in at an angle, you want to stop right away because you could damage the knuckle. So periodically go in, assess the alignment, and make sure that it's not off center. Now that the ball joint's seated into the knuckle, we just want to double check the seams to make sure everything looks flush. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this C-clamp here. And the first thing you want to make a note of is that the ball joint has pressed through the knuckle, and then you can see where the snap ring goes right there. So yes, that's pressed through the knuckle, and more importantly, you want to make sure that the sleeve of the ball joint is flush with this knuckle, and you can see that it's nice and flush right there. So we're looking pretty good here. Now we're ready to finish the installation of the ball joint. Now we can go ahead and place the rubber boot on top of the ball joint. You can see I've placed a lot of grease inside the boot. I really overdid it. Don't place that much grease inside there. There's some grease feedings that come with this Mevitech ball joint. That's why I bought this setup, so we can add grease periodically. And you can see now I've made a big mess on top of the bolt here of the ball joint. So I've got to wipe all that away. So once we get the boot nice and seated up on top, we can use that little plastic sleeve that I showed you earlier, place it over the top of this rubber boot here, and now we're going to tap it down with a rubber mallet until it clicks on, and that worked pretty easily here. No problems with this. Now that the boot is on, we can go ahead and loosely place the nut on top of the ball joint here, and we can go ahead and torque that down later and place the cotter pin in. But before we go any further, let's make sure that we put the snap ring on the bottom of the ball joint. This is very important. The snap ring keeps the ball joint from sliding out of the knuckle. Very big safety mechanism here, and you can see I'm using some snap ring pliers to place this snap ring in place. They're pretty cheap. You can pick them up at AutoZone or at your hardware store for about 20 bucks. So boom, we got that in here, and now our ball joint's nice and secure into the knuckle. Now here's a little tip on reinstallation. Of course, I bolted up the lower control arm to the subframe first, then I slid the end link through the lower control arm and loosely put the nut on. Then I went over to the ball joint, seated that into the lower control arm and loosely placed the nut on there. And then I ended up with a bolt and nut through the strut here, and that really was the best order for me. It made it a lot easier. I also used my jack to kind of push up on the lower control arm and to take some of the tension off. So try that method if you're having trouble getting your lower control arm and all the nuts and bolts bolted back in. That might help you out. So at this point, I'm going to give you a little sneak peek at the brand new Z-Speed garage. We've got a nice new 3-car garage now. I even got a refrigerator this time, and I've even got an area for a break room I'm going to put in there. I'm not going to really show you that yet, but it's going to be really nice when I get it done. I haven't really finished putting everything where it needs to go yet, but you can see I've got room for the Honda and the 350Z plus another car on the other side, and we've just got a lot more room. It's awesome. Thanks for all the support and everybody watching and subscribing. So if this video helped you out, make sure that you give me a big old fat thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Join the Z-Speed team. This year we're gonna have a lot of great stuff coming, and I'm gonna give you a little tip. We're gonna do a automatic transmission to manual swap, so stay tuned for that. We'll see you soon.